And Elsevier for the past 130 years has been a publisher. But with the arrival of the digital age, Elsevier also had to modernize. So around the year 2000, the company moved from giving people stuff to read to helping people search for things that they should be reading. Nowadays, we call ourselves an information analytics company. And part of our mission really is to advance healthcare. Right? We help professionals advance healthcare, enable open science, improve professional performance, and our mindset nowadays is, how can we help our customers do their job, right? Instead of giving them stuff to read, how can we actually help them answer questions that they need to answer in order to do their job? And at Elsevier, I work in health solutions. So the talk I'm going to give to you is really about the stuff we're doing in the clinical side of the company. So let's talk a little bit about moment of truth. A moment of truth in healthcare is when you go to the doctor and you're scared and you're in pain and you hope that the doctor knows more than you do about the disease that you have, or at least they know more than what you could read on Google. So that's a moment of truth. But moments of truth, they're not one point in time, right? A moment of truth includes all the way from patient intake, when the patient comes to the doctor's office for the first time, physical examination, a patient history. The doctor will talk to you and ask you, what are your symptoms? Have you had any symptoms like this before? They will order some lab tests. At that point, they have some hypothesis of what it is that you have. Then they will examine the lab test results, and they'll come up with an initial diagnosis. Hopefully, they'll call you back in and say, hey, I've got a diagnosis. Let's think about treatment. And so you'll get an initial treatment. The treatment doesn't always work the first time, or the dosage is not always right the first time. And so many times the doctor will ask you to come back for a follow-up. And then it could be that the treatment that the doctor gives you too many side effects. So in many cases, the side effects are just not worth it for many patients, and they say, I don't want this treatment anymore, just find me something else. And so there's a back and forth here between the patient and the doctor. And many times this back and forth is actually not taken into consideration. It's super critical to help the doctors do their job, to understand this back and forth. And the argument I'm going to try to make today is that data science empowers all of these moments of truth. And I'm going to particularly focus on 3 particular domains, and I'm going to give examples of how the community is addressing it. I could say Elsevier, but fortunately it's not only Elsevier who's working in this domain. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the initial diagnosis. How does a doctor make a diagnosis? There's thousands of diseases nowadays classified in the ICD, and there's tens of thousands of possible lab tests that a doctor could order. Treatment delivery and follow-up is another thing I want to talk to you guys about. It has a lot to do with drug discovery and understanding how small molecules interact with bioproteins, which are the elements of the cell. And then alternative treatments. How do you repurpose drugs that have already been FDA approved for rare diseases and for cancer types for which the drug hasn't yet been approved? All right, let's talk about the initial diagnosis. Who here has seen Dr. House? All right, good. So you know that in every episode of Dr. House, he usually has a patient that has this disease that nobody knows what it is, and so he assembles his team and he just writes in the whiteboard all the symptoms that the patient has. And so let's take this example that he has on the whiteboard. So the patient came in, he had chronic fatigue, rashes, and a sore throat. Right? For any one of these symptoms, there's a possible set of diagnoses. So if the patient has rashes and chronic fatigue, maybe it's Lyme disease, right? Maybe it's arsenic poisoning. But he also has to take into consideration the prevalence of this disease in the time of year, because it's much more likely that it's a flu than it is arsenic poisoning. So the question here that we're trying to answer is, how do we maximize the probability of a right answer while minimizing the number of tests that Dr. House has to order? In order to stay on top of his game, right, Dr. House and his team have to read thousands of papers. So and you guys might know, the number of papers getting published every year is going up. So research is moving very, very fast. It's easier to publish. Nowadays you also have preprint, so we don't rely on journals alone anymore. I work at Elsevier, and the number of things that get submitted to Elsevier is growing every year, which is good, but at the same time it also means that these doctors have to keep up with a lot more material than they had before. So there's about 2.6 papers being published. There's about 1 paper being published every 2.6 seconds. And even if Dr. House decided to just focus on one specialty, let's say oncology, even in that case, you would have to be able to read 130,000 papers per year, which is what PubMed tells us is the number of papers timed with oncology every year. So one way or one proxy we could use to approximate getting all of this knowledge in a format that Dr. House can easily digest is by building knowledge graphs. And for those of you who have never heard about a knowledge graph, think about it as trying to encode the knowledge in a doctor's brain into something that a computer can process. Right? It's a proxy, it's not perfect, but hey, it's a start. So how do we build a knowledge graph? Take this sentence as an example. The Pap smear is an effective screening procedure for invasive cervical cancer. We've got medical taxonomies nowadays that capture all of these keywords and their synonyms. So we can very easily do named entity recognition in these sentences and find these elements that are actually encoded as medical taxonomies. And the second step then is there's a relationship being expressed here in this sentence between these two concepts that we just tagged with our named entity recognition. And it's of type screening procedure. So the third part of this knowledge graph element is capturing the relationship between those two concepts. This is just like a link. Like when you go on the web and you go from document to document to document, those are document links. What I'm showing you here are data links. And then, of course, you can add metadata. You can create metadata about this relationship, or with triples is what we call them. And you could say what's the source, how certain the author was in that statement, what's the context, etc. Now, imagine putting all of these triples together. What do you get? You get a network, you get a graph, right? Something you can navigate. You can now build queries, and you can keep walking toward the next link, and you can aggregate, you can find clicks, and you can do graph analysis with this type of data sets. But of course, we can build this manually. As I said, 130,000 papers alone in oncology. So we're trying to do this automatically. But here's a challenge. When we start looking at these sentences, and we look beyond the entities, we look beyond the concepts, the sentences don't always state a fact. So take these 3 examples. They're all about the same 2 things, Pap smears and cervical cancer. But the first one says, we could not find evidence that Pap smear is an effective procedure for cervical cancer. The second one says, the evidence points at a possible role of Pap smears in screening for cervical cancer. And the third one says, we hypothesize that Pap smear may be effective for cervical cancer. They say completely different things, right? And you can't really derive a fact from any of these. The first one actually is the opposite of a fact, right? And this hedging is actually very, very commonly found in medical literature. I spoke with our editors at Cell Press, and they said, hey, yeah, we asked the authors to use hedging. We asked them to not state facts. We actually asked them to say, the data points toward the possible world. So this is intentional, and it's all over the medical literature. So the way we're trying to solve this problem, I'm not going to say we solved it because our accuracy is not that high yet, but so what we do is we pick up examples with named entity recognition from the literature, and then we create triple candidates, right? Now, our training data is actually made up of triples we've already classified, so training data that has already been prepared for us by our curators, and we have both the sentence and the triple that was extracted from it. We then apply machine learning to evaluate if those triple candidates coming from the sentence are indeed telling us that this is the relationship which you get from there. And then we ask our subject matter experts, and we need to have 2 out of 3 to agree, is this correct? When you look at this sentence, is this the triple you would collect from this sentence? And if 2 out of 3 agree, then the good triples make its way back into our knowledge graph, and then they become part of the new training data. So every time this process occurs, we have more training data. And the bad triples also make its way into the machine learning model because they become our negative examples. Right? So as you know, a machine learning model always needs to learn from positive and negative examples. But it's not just about symptoms and tests. Diagnosis also, specifically for cancer, has a lot of it has a lot to win from using medical images. So typically, when an oncologist is determining if the patient has cancer or not, they will, yes, look at medical test results, but they will also look at pathology images and radiology images. And if there are signs that there's cancer, then the doctor will resort to their knowledge, to their expertise, and they will also resort to some medical material, and they will decide whether it's cancer or not. And as you can imagine, making this decision is extremely hard, because if you tell a patient that they have cancer and they don't, and then they go off and get extremely toxic therapies, right? They're not going to be very happy about it. And the same thing with the opposite. So if you tell a patient that they don't have cancer and they do have cancer, then they go home, their tumor is going to continue growing. So this decision is an extremely difficult decision to make. On top of it all, the world is running out of medical image specialists. So just to give you an idea, a radiologist nowadays has to look at 3 to 4 images every second just to keep up. And the pathologists are looking at over 200 slides per day, looking for only a few cells in a sea of millions of cells. So obviously this is where deep learning algorithms have really taken off, and there's a number of companies already that can do this fairly well with fairly high accuracy, and they are FDA approved. So this is typically what you have. So they overlay a heat map on top of the image itself, and you can see the parts of the image that are indicative of cancer. But there's a problem. Who of you can tell me, of this image, what is a fried chicken and what is cancer? Right? That's very easy, you can easily tell. But many deep learning algorithms actually get very confused about this. What if I showed you this though? Which of these 2 images, the one on the top or the one in the bottom, is cancer? Right? You can't tell. If I hadn't been trained, I couldn't tell either. And therein lies the problem. When you're building a machine learning or a machine vision method, and if it's doing the right thing, you can easily detect it and fix it. But if you're doing that with images that you don't understand, it's very likely that you're going to make mistakes, and those are going to go unnoticed. And then just to solve the problem here, the one with cancer is the one on top. Oops. There we go. I didn't know it was a touch screen. That's cool. So this is the cancer area. Usually the place where you see the cells bigger and misshaped, that's cancer. But when I applied that exact same model on this image that has no cancer whatsoever, it still did something, right? It still classified 3/4 of the image as cancer. This is complete bullshit. I apologize for my French, but this is wrong. And yet these models are not being filtered. We're just using these models. We can use them with any image. They will do something, and this is the real danger behind using just pure deep learning to do medical image analysis. Here's another example. The MIT researchers just took a model that was trained to do facial image recognition on general purpose images, and you could see the model did very well when you gave it a gazelle. And said, oh, this is a mammal with 92% certainty. Then they added 10% noise to the image, and look what happened. Suddenly, the model thought that a gazelle was actually a tree, right? With fairly high certainty, 85%. So this is a big problem, right? This is serious, and it doesn't even reflect bias in the data. It reflects the ease with which machine learning can be applied to these data sets nowadays, especially when there's no domain X, when there's no diversity in the team that's actually training these models. And of course, Mount Sinai last year discovered that when they trained the machine learning model on their data set, then they tried to sell it to other hospitals, it wouldn't generalize. It would only work with data collected at Mount Sinai. Google is actually coming up with this interesting strategy. So they don't try to replace the pathologists. They don't try to replace the medical specialists altogether. What Google is doing is they've created a microscope that has this little piece that connects to a computer. And so what the pathologists see when they look to the eyepieces, and they see a region overlaid on their actual image, which is essentially the machine learning model says, hey, look here. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you should zoom into this area, and you should be able to see what you're looking for. So this is what we're calling the augmented pathologist or the augmented doctor. We're not going to replace medical specialists, but we're going to augment them so that they can do this type of analysis much more easily. All right, so let's talk a little bit about identifying therapies. We're halfway through the talk, so and let me start by telling you a little bit about this new, it's not so new anymore, but about personalized medicine, precision medicine. And doctors are increasingly becoming aware of this. Our genetics impacts how we respond to drugs. Not just which diseases we're going to get, but also how we're going to respond to treatment. And this is an example of my own 23andMe genetic profile. And the fact that I have the genotype C and T on that particular position in my genome means that I am highly sensitive to warfarin. Now, warfarin is a blood thinner. So if ever I get a blood clot, my doctors will treat me with warfarin. But if they don't look at my genetic profile and they give me a dosage for my weight and height, I may actually get the wrong dosage, which will mean I would bleed to death if they didn't look at my genomic profile. That's how important these data points are becoming nowadays. So how do we solve this? How can data science help in this moment of truth? And I'll give you an example from this product that Elsevier has called Reaxys. And Reaxys is essentially a tool that people who build drugs and people who build the labels for drugs use to figure out which compounds and which sensitivities that will be associated with those compounds. And a ton of that information is actually in patents. So patents typically have the structure of the compound and a bunch of derivatives from that compound, and they also have these nice tables of biological activity. And so it's a pain reading a patent. I don't know if you've ever tried. And nobody wants to read a patent. So, and many times the companies that produce those patents obfuscate some of the elements because they don't want their competitors to actually pick up on their processes. And so we used to hire chemists. We used to pluck them from a lab and hire them to actually read patents for us and extract the compounds that they found on the patents and those biological activity tables and save them on Reaxys, where we could then make this data accessible to others. But of course, this process was not only costly, but it was also not scalable, because if you wanted to be able to screen more patents, you had to hire more people. And of course, the quality was not easily standardized, because each chemist would do their own thing, would capture, would consider different things as they were reading the paper, things worth capturing. So what did we do? We took the data set that it had already generated for us, and off of the patents, we've identified a bunch of features. Words, paragraphs, sentences, features that were indicative of whether or not this was a portion of a patent that was worth capturing and saving into Reaxys. Then what we did was just use a support vector machine classifier, and those of you who have used SVMs before know you really don't need to pre-identify the features when you use an SVM. And so the SVM was able to kind of separate the relevant from the irrelevant features. And once we did that, we were able to then collect the structure of the compound from the patent, and finally we were able to put this on the database without affecting the quality of the extractions. And by doing this, we went from being able to parse 10,000 patents per year to being able to parse 82,000 patents per year, which was pretty powerful. But we don't want to be the only ones able to do that. So Elsevier has built this platform called Intellect, which is essentially powered by a knowledge graph under the hood so that others can actually have access to this data and do the analysis themselves. So basically, Intellect does the data collection and the data cleaning for you, and then you can do feature extraction, you can train and tune your model, test your model, and then you can compare your models against models that other people have built. And once that is done, you can compare models, you can deploy the models. And last year, actually, Elsevier organized a datathon and gave the datathon participants access to this platform, to the Intellect platform. And the datathon participants actually were able to identify 5 drug candidates for chronic pancreatitis that are now being tested in a pre-clinical trial setting. All right, so finally, let's talk a little bit about follow-up and the patient journey. All this time, I've been telling you about the doctor's perspective. So let's think a little bit about the patient's perspective. And I apologize for the quality of this picture, but I loved it as soon as I saw it. When a patient gets diagnosed, in this case is RA, rheumatoid arthritis, they don't immediately jump to, hey, let's find a treatment, let's find a solution. No, the patient actually many times, they go into denial, right? Is it me? Do I really have RA? Do I really have cancer? Do I really have Alzheimer's? So there's a period of denial and lack of acceptance that you are indeed sick, you indeed have this chronic disease. Even the patients that accept it, right, they still have trouble adjusting to the disease, trouble adjusting to their need to now start going to the doctor's office every week or every 2 weeks. And many of them fall into depression, right? So the team that solved the depression problem, come talk to me because this is huge and we should work together. So the ones that fall into depression often just fall off the medical system. We never see them again, right? They just decide to live with the disease and not procure treatment. Which is very sad. Now, there is a group of patients that some patients actually engage with the doctor and they want to be treated. And then, I mean, this is particularly serious in the US, there's cost barriers. So they get the prescription, they go try to fill it out, and it's just way too expensive for them and their families. So many of them decide, okay, I'll just live with it, right? They decide to not get treated. In other cases, the ones that actually engage, sometimes they have side effects, and the side effects are so serious that it's just not worth taking the treatment anymore. And say, again, they drop off of the medical system. The ones that stay often have different expectations of what the efficacy of the treatment is, because as you know, not all treatments are 100% effective. So if you had RA symptoms and you're expecting those symptoms to go away as soon as you start treatment, many times those expectations are not real. And then, there's a series of other reasons why patients fall off the medical system. And so for a doctor, when they're confronted with this moment of truth, when they see the patient again, right, they have to figure out what are they going to do. Do they start by treating the depression? Or should they just help the patient figure out insurance? Or should they focus on the side effects, right? Or should we get more tests? Should we change the drug, right? These are all the questions going on in the head of the doctor when they see this patient again. And guidelines are these gigantic medical documents, you may have seen them, usually available in PDF by these well-renowned societies, but nowhere in these guidelines is the question, is the patient depressed? Or, is the patient struggling with insurance? So these things all have a role to play in whether or not the patient will get better. And yet these guidelines are not capturing that. So here's an idea, and I'm very far away from implementing this, but let me just give you a few hints of how this could be solved. Who here has heard about reinforcement learning approaches? Yeah. So for those who haven't, very quickly, usually there's an agent, which is our machine learning model we're trying to train, and the agent will do something to the environment according to some policy that it has learned, and then it'll observe what happens to the environment after that action, right? And it'll change the policy accordingly. And then it'll do this many, many, many times until the policies result in higher reward based on whatever the agent is doing to the environment. Now imagine that what you're learning are the medical guidelines, the environment that you're changing is the medical outcome, or the reward you get is for improving the outcome, and the treatment is the actual action you're doing in order to improve the outcome of the patient. So there's actually a paper on arXiv where they've built a system to learn guidelines based on for sepsis treatment. So this kind of stuff is coming and really is going to, I think, make a huge difference in the way we treat patients. All right, finally, I know I don't have much time, I have 2 minutes, I'll just run through this. Caveats and biases, and this is so important for all of us to be aware as we start, really building these models to train based on data, predictive models. Always ask yourself, right, when you're building a model, are your classes balanced, right? So very common in clinical trials, they have 10 men and 2 women. That's not a balanced class, right? So the people who organize the trial are at fault, but we as the data scientists who are working with it need to raise the issue as well. Second question, for that example where I showed you where the model did the complete wrong thing with the non-cancer image, there's something very easy you could do, right? You can look at the pixel distribution on the images on the training set, and you can ask, is this image that you're giving me, is this in the same distribution of pixels? And if it's not, you probably shouldn't try to make a prediction with your model. Third one, can you generalize, right? So the Mount Sinai example, they built the model based on the images they had on their hospital, and then they try to use it elsewhere. It was not generalizable. So it's very important to be able to answer this question, can I generalize my model? It can still be useful, but if it's not generalizable, don't try to sell it to somebody else. Are you looking far enough back? So with the patient journey example, are you taking into consideration seasonality? Because the winter tends to get people depressed. It may have nothing to do with the actual data points that you're capturing. So looking far enough back, capturing enough data points, it's super critical in order to build a powerful model. And at last, don't ever try to use the model for something that data was not prepared for, because if you have curators going over these images and drawing regions where they think the cancer is, and this is the only thing they're thinking about when they're preparing the training data, right? So they may have missed some piece of cancer over here, and you shouldn't treat that as a negative, right? They just missed it. So don't try to use the model for something other than what the data set was prepared to do. All right, so finally, take-home messages. Building data science for healthcare is a high risk, but it's also a high reward endeavor. AI-based techniques will never replace doctors, I think, but doctors who use AI-based techniques will replace doctors who don't use AI-based techniques. And at last, guidelines are hard to build, but they have the potential to make healthcare fairer for everyone by including people who would otherwise fall off the system. And I could not say that we have positions open for smart data scientists like you guys. We've got a cool culture of women at tech. We've got women groups in every office. We're a little bit all over the world. We're about 25% of our tech workforce is made out of women. And just today, I saw an email from our CEO, Kumsal, who's a woman, she got, I don't know if you guys know the Each for Equal sign that's being promoted it's being promoted for the International Women's Day, and she got the whole management team, our CEO, our CIO, and everybody doing the Each for Equal sign, which was kind of cool. Okay, thank you very much.
We have time for one short question, and then we will move on with the break, so then you can over coffee answer some other questions. Is there somebody who would like to pose a question? Or everyone is in need of coffee and tea? That could also be.
I've got one in the back.
Yeah, one in the back. Oscar?
Thank you. Fantastic presentation. I'm wondering about the fact extraction part, because in practice, when we extract those facts, especially in the scientific fields, it just ends up being, there's simply a lot of mistakes being made. So I'm sure that a lot of people here are going to go into this knowledge graph building in some part of their career, and probably they already did. So do you have any learnings to share about that stuff?
Yeah, don't make it a Boolean. Make it, so capture the level of certainty, and which is not easy, but when you're asking your curators to kind of like go over these sentences and whether the triples are correct or not, don't just ask them to say yes or no. Ask them to capture how certain are you in this triple.
Right, but then you need the SMEs, right, for that?
You need the SMEs, but there are knowledge graphs that are publicly available that you could use actually.
Did you see the SMEs themselves wondering a lot about how they should classify a certain fact? Because
they do, and it's funny because they also come up with their own guidelines to use within the group.
Right.
But it's not easy. It's not easy because it's the nature of scientific research, right?
And did you have to rely on extra SMEs because you had 3, right? Up to 3. Did you ever have a reason to have more?
Yeah. I mean, we used to use Mechanical Turk a lot.
What was the quality of that?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't. I wouldn't use it for medical data.
Okay.
But you know, you write a test. If your Turkers pass it, then you accept their data.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Lisa, I also would like to thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
And then I'm happy to invite you again all for coffee and tea in the lobby. See you within half an hour.